Welcome all. Welcome to this final session of Pathbreaking, this year's College of the Atlantic Summer Institute. My name is Sylvia Torti, and I have the honor of being president of this remarkable college. Yeah, thank you. I first want to give a huge shout out and thank you to the incredibly talented Lynn Bulger, the former advancement director and longtime friend of the college. This past year, she served as the interim director of our Summer Institute and was the mastermind behind shaping what has been, as you have all been telling me all week, a resounding success. Thank you, Lynn. Before we launch into this final session, I'd like to share a few thoughts. I've been thinking about the smart and gripping stories we've heard this week. And it occurred to me this afternoon that what will stay with me the longest and have the most impact are the questions and attitudes that path-breaking leaders seem to share. These are some of the same questions and attitudes that we help students explore here at the College of the Atlantic. Who are you? What do you believe? Where are we? And where are we going? This week has demonstrated the relevance of historical inquiry, helping us ask, how can we learn from the way people, past and present, have used their values, their convictions, and resolve to inform and propel their work over years and even decades? These are just a few. From Charles Sumner in 19th century trying to abolish slavery, to 20th century Ireland, from the pivotal art show Black Male curated by Thelma Golden, to the more recent insights by Dr. Corbett Hilaire about the science and socio-political complexities of a global pandemic. And then, of course, Navalny, his deep conviction and the ability to ask and answer for himself, what will I give up for what I believe is right? The scholars and speakers we've encountered this week have demonstrated that, despite their deep expertise in particular areas, they don't get lost in abstraction of their specializations. They humanize. One takeaway from the week is that we get caught up in intractable conflict because we struggle to see the human complexity of others. Our path-breaking leaders revealed themselves as people who are willing to engage with others, even others who have done terrible wrongs, and to engage them with an honest curiosity about them as individuals. Path-breaking leaders acknowledge and respect the notion of shared humanity, because this is what, in fact, creates a path forward. Furthermore, our speakers have used the path to help guide future thinking. In fact, Navrina Singh, speaking on AI with Nick Thompson this morning, reminded us that predicting the future is hard, but making the future is necessary. David Hogg presented us with a multi-generational vision of the possibilities available to us if we combine age and experience in dynamic ways. And as Senator Mitchell reminded us so forcefully, just listen, listen. Finally, the quality of a pathbreaker, perhaps the final and most important quality, is humility. The humility to understand the explicitly constrained roles of a single human existence, and yet to continue to work to deepen our understanding from every perspective available to us, to do what we can for as long as we are present here on this gorgeous and wondrous, ever-evolving planet. At the beginning of my second year as president, I couldn't be happier to be in community with you all, listeners and questioners, forging our future together through collective intelligence. This is human ecology. Thank you. To introduce tonight's session with Doris Kearns Goodwin and with Ted Widmer, I'd like to invite Finn Wentworth to the podium. Finn and his wife Kim are longtime friends and supporters of COA. They've been important advisors to us as well over the years. His life and career in entrepreneurship, including his partnership in the New York Yankees, is an inspiration to all of us. Welcome, Finn.
We'll get to the Yankees along the way here. Yeah, as you all know, these things just don't happen. They just don't appear. So I wanted to take a moment because 9 years ago there was a concept, and the concept was with Will Thorndike and Judy Goldberg and Darren Collins. And I don't think they envisioned there'd be a parking problem on a night like tonight. But there is, and there will be in the future. And so they were the visionaries, and now the stewards are Sylvia and Sean and Lynn. And I want to just give a round of applause to them. So when you stop and think about it, what's somebody from the New York Yankees doing at the front tonight with Doris Kearns Goodwin, a lifelong Dodger fan, an adopted Red Sox Nation member by marriage, and the reality is that Sylvia, Sean, and Lynn, I think they have a really good sense of humor, and this past winter, they were sitting in Maine in the middle of winter going, the Summer Institute's coming up. We got Doris. What are we going to do? And they just said, let's try Finn. Like, he seems like an easy touch. We'll go for him. And so when they called me up and they announced that Doris was going to be up here, I just started chuckling. And Sean said, what's so funny? I said, well, Kim and I just had dinner with Doris Kearns Goodwin and our dear long-term friend, Governor Kane from New Jersey, who is not just a two-time governor, but an environmentalist, a person for women's rights, somebody who's like nostalgic. He was co-chairman of the 9/11 Commission when they had a Republican and a Democrat run the commission and do God's work for our country. And the two of them, and Kim and I and just a few other folks, sat around the table at Drew University where he had been president, and it was like a magic night. It was a magic night with you, Doris. And Kim and I reflect on that. It was so powerful because the basic message coming out was hope. That is, that you don't have to just think that this is going to go on forever. We've been in worse places. We can come out. So maybe tonight we'll hear a little bit about that hope. But what also Sean didn't realize, and certainly Lynn or Sylvia, was that Doris and I shared a friend who 25 years ago, I always thought he was stalking her, but my wife Kim said, no, he's a groupie of Doris Kearns Goodwin. And his name was Lewis Katz, and he was a partner in the New York Yankees, and he was one of those people who was kind of Damon Runyon type in terms of his wardrobe, in terms of his outspokenness. He bought the Philadelphia Inquirer. Unfortunately, he passed away in an accident. But along the way, he was there with the Yes Network and these other things that we did. And he did a lot of good for the common man in the city of Camden. So that was something that always struck me. And Doris and I have had some enjoyable talks about that. So tonight, we're talking about path breakers, and I just want to touch on a few things about Doris. Many of these things, we think of Doris, and they come up right away, and a few that they don't. Beyond all the awards, she was a graduate first. She was a graduate from Northern Maine, right, from Colby College, which up here we know it's like the neighborhood, Colby College. She was one of the very first female White House fellows. It was during the LBJ administration, and she was fascinating. We'll get to this in a minute, and she'll talk about it tonight. But her husband, Dick Goodwin, of course, was there through the JFK Camelot, and she came in the LBJ, and their new book is her book is phenomenal. She was a presidential historian, the Carnegie Medal for her Teddy Roosevelt book, the Lincoln Prize for Team of Rivals, which until recently was my favorite Doris Kearns Goodwin book, and many, many others. But one of my favorite accomplishments, if you will, she was the first woman to enter the Red Sox locker room. That is a true fan. Imagine trying to find a gift for Doris, somebody who's been so many places, done so many things, and something that you just can't take for granted, but you want to give a memento. So we by the way, great bookstore, Hidden Barn Books. They're right over here tonight, okay? And oh my God, it's not a book. Hold on. Oh my God, look at this. It's on a hanger, Doris.
What?
Oh.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
That is so
Doris,
cool.
it's a nightshirt. That's what that is. Well, I just want to say that we're so gifted to have Doris with us tonight. We're also gifted to have Ted with us. Ted Widmer is, in his own right, a nationally acclaimed historian, as many of you in this room know. And to have somebody who Kim and I have gotten to know over the last several years here on MDI, and a family relationship through the Rhinelanders and a few other things along the way, we're so happy to have you. So a warm welcome, please, for Doris and Ted.
Thank you. Thank you, Finn. Finn is a good friend, but I have to do something to restore balance in this symposium, and I want Doris to feel at home here in New England, so if you'll forgive me. I want to echo what Sylvia and Finn said about the incredible team that puts this together. Sean and Lynn and Sylvia herself and Will and Judy for conceiving the idea all those years ago. And I think I've been to every single one. And I appreciate your generosity inviting me many past summers when I truly knew nothing about the event I was introducing, but I was allowed to participate anyway. And tonight I finally know a little something. Doris executive produced a wonderful documentary about Abraham Lincoln a couple years ago, and I was one of the people interviewed, and we've shared conversations and notes, mainly about Lincoln, but about a lot of other presidents. We just had a wonderful conversation a minute ago. This being COA, everything is done with the finest attention to detail, and the flowers are very real. And she said, be careful, there's a bee flying around the flowers in between us. So we are going to talk about visionary leaders in times of crisis, path breakers in their own way. And I want to begin by asking Doris how she found the 4 presidents she has written so compellingly about. She's written about many presidents, but she keeps coming back to 4 in particular, whom she calls my guys. And they are Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson, whom she worked for in the 1960s and into the 1970s. So, Doris, how did you find your way to my guys?
I hope it doesn't sound too lack of deference to be calling them my guys. It's just that I've lived with them so long. I lived with them longer than anyone except for my husband. It took me 10 years to write about Franklin and Eleanor. It took me longer than the Civil War to write about the Civil War and Lincoln. So you do think about them. You think about them as your guys. But it certainly began with Lyndon Johnson. I mean, I would have been an historian, but my PhD was actually in Supreme Court history, so I would have been studying those characters in their robes instead of presidents, had it not been for the fact that when I was a graduate student at Harvard, I was selected, as was said, as a White House Fellow, and ended up working for Lyndon Johnson. It had a very peculiar beginning, my relationship with Lyndon Johnson. We had a big dance at the White House the night we were selected, and President Johnson did dance with me. It wasn't peculiar. There were only 3 women out of the 16 White House Fellows. But as he twirled me around the floor, he whispered that he wanted me to be assigned directly to him in the White House. But it turned out not to be that simple, because in the months leading up to my selection, like many young people, I was active in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and a friend of mine and I had written an article against LBJ, against the war in Vietnam, which we'd sent to the New Republic but heard nothing until several days after the dance. It suddenly appeared with their title, How to Remove Lyndon Johnson in 1968. So I was certain he would kick me out of the program, but instead, surprisingly, he said, oh, bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can. So I did end up working for him in the White House and then accompanying him to his ranch to help him on his memoirs. And that's when I really got to know him. That's when I really became, in many ways, a presidential historian. Mostly he just wanted to talk. He talked and he talked everywhere we were. We'd be swimming in the pool and there'd be rafts with floating notepads so that I could take notes of what he was saying. He talked as he was waiting for a movie to go. And he mostly wanted to talk about days before the war in Vietnam. Luckily, the 2 chapters I was working on were civil rights and Congress, so he was very happy to talk to me rather than the other team members who were working on foreign policy or Vietnam. And he talked about what it was like when he was a young congressman, when he brought electricity to his beloved hill country. He talked about civil rights and voting rights and about how he hoped he'd be remembered for some of those things. And it seemed to me that I wondered sometimes, why is he spending so many hours with me? And I thought maybe it's because I'm a good listener, and I'd like to believe that. And he was a fabulous, colorful storyteller, so there was no reason you wouldn't want to listen. I also thought maybe it was because I was at Harvard and he had this thing about Harvard. And then I thought maybe it's because I'm a young woman, so I was constantly chattering to him about steady boyfriends, even when I had no boyfriends at all. It was all working perfectly until one day he said he wanted to discuss our relationship, which sounded ominous. He took me nearby to the lake, conveniently called Lake Lyndon Johnson. There's wine and cheese and a red check tablecloth, all the romantic trappings. And he starts out, "Doris, more than any other woman I have ever known," and my heart sank. And then he said, "You remind me of my mother." So it was pretty embarrassing, given what was going on in my mind. But I must say, the older I've gotten, the more I realize how lucky I was to have spent so many hours with this aging lion of a man, a victor in 1,000 contests: Medicare, Medicaid, aid to education, civil rights, voting rights, immigration reform, NPR, PBS. It's just so sad to think of all these great programs that were there at that time and what a feeling it was to be part of that during that era. And I think once I finished the first book on him, I realized I really want to study other presidents who were in path-breaking times, just as we're talking about today. So then what does that mean? That means Franklin Roosevelt in World War II and the Depression. It meant Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, and it meant finally Teddy Roosevelt in the turn of the 20th century. And each one of them were in those times of crisis, so I felt like I was being catapulted back to those eras. And it's the great thing, I know you know, Ted, as an historian, is you're living in the Civil War. I mean, why should you want to be living back in the Civil War today? But somehow you knew how it ended. That's the great thing. And you're living in the Great Depression, or you're living in World War II. And so all of a sudden, 50 years have gone by, and I've been studying dead presidents my whole life. But I wouldn't change it for anything in the world. The only fear I've had is that in the afterlife, there'll be a panel of all these guys that I studied, and everyone will tell me everything I missed about them. And the first person to scream out, of course, will be Lyndon Johnson. How come that damn book on the Roosevelts was twice as long as the book he wrote about me? So that's how my guys began. I could never write about a Mussolini or a Hitler or a Stalin. I want to write about somebody that I basically respect. They'll always disappoint you in some ways or other. They'll always be limited by the context of their time. But I wanted to wake up with them and think about them when I went to bed at night and like them fundamentally. So luckily, those are the people that I've chosen.
I want to salute you for being a pathbreaker as a relatively rare female biographer of the presidents. And you mentioned you were one of the few female staff advisors to LBJ. And it is my guise because there have only been male presidents. But were you inspired by female historians as you were starting out?
Oh, without a question. The book that I read that had a fundamental impact on me was Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August. I read it when I was in college, and so it was a female historian writing, and a female historian writing about war, too, which was great. But more importantly, she just was such an incredible writer that at the beginning of that book, she talks about a funeral going on where all the characters in the book are going to be there. So she introduces everybody at the beginning, which made me try to think about how do I write history the way she did. Because what she said is when you're writing about a war, you have to, or whatever you're writing about, you have to imagine you do not know how that war ended. So you can carry your reader with you every step along the way, knowing only what they knew at the time. And that's the key to narrative history, right? Sometimes I think in the academic world, you tend to put in your own little thoughts about how it ended and how it might have been different, and you lose the narrative structure. She was a great storyteller. And I'd like to believe that that's the thing I've wanted to be from the time I was a little girl, a storyteller, not even more than a historian. Historians are storytellers.
We are drawn to history, I think, for many reasons, but it can be a comfort in a time of political difficulty, shall we say. And as we are going through a number of crises, arguably in 2025, do you see precedents in the careers of the 4 presidents you've studied so closely? Democracy came pretty close to the brink just before Lincoln was inaugurated and arguably while he was president, and all of the other presidents had to deal with fundamental crises. So do you draw consolation from your study of the past?
Absolutely. I mean, this is why I think history is so important and why it's heartbreaking that it's being taught less in schools, that we're being told that we shouldn't teach people about troubling times, just teach them about the good times. Because what's made America is the troubling times became something wonderful, that strength emerged from those. And if we look back at those times when the people living there, as I was saying, Barbara Tuckman taught me to do, they didn't know how it was going to end. When Lincoln took his office in that time that Ted's written about so brilliantly of Lincoln on the verge during that period of time, he said that if he had ever known what he was going to face in those first 3 months, he would not have thought he could have lived through it. He was that anxious about it. And anxious because he thought democracy was absolutely at risk. He said at one time that the central issue, he thought this was like in April of '61, he said this, is whether or not if the southern states could decide to secede from the Union because they had not won an election, then it would prove that democracy was an absurdity. And you had to fight them seceding or else the whole experiment would fall apart. So he knew that. And they didn't know until much later that it was going to end with the Union restored and emancipation secured. So they lived with the anxiety we're living with today. But democracy prevailed. And then think of what it was like for Franklin Roosevelt in particular. When he came in, 1 out of 4 people out of work. The banking system had collapsed. People couldn't get their money out of the banks. There were starving people in the streets because there was no safety net. There was a sense, really, that the country was coming to an end. And somebody said to him when he was about to give his first inaugural, you know, if you do well and your program works, you'll be one of the great presidents in history. But if you fail, you'll be one of the worst. And he said, no, very soberly, he said, I'll be the last American president. That's how he felt, the risk of democracy. And then think what it was like at the start of World War II when Hitler went through all of Western Europe in the space of 1 week, leaving only England eventually standing alone. We were so far behind. We were only 18th in military power at that point. We let our military establishment go. We wanted to help Britain, but we had only 500 fighter planes. We had more horses than tanks. We were the only thing hoping to help England, but England stood alone. They didn't know that that was going to work. If Western civilization had been undone by Hitler, it would have been over. Democracy and everything we know that we value would have been over. And so what we think about history, the important thing is that it gives us lessons when we look at the past, and we'll talk about those in more detail. What was it about those leaders that made them help to get through that time? What was it about the citizenry? It gives us solace to know that we've been through these hard times before. And I do believe it gives us hope. Hope that if other generations lived through even more troubling times than ours, and we came through with greater strength, my God, we have to do it ourselves. And I think that's going to give us that impetus to know our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents did it for us. Now we have to do it for our children as well.
Wonderful. From this stage a couple nights ago, David Rubenstein expressed his opinion that Abraham Lincoln is head and shoulders above all the other presidents as our greatest. And I don't have any problem agreeing with that assessment. He got us through our most serious crisis, a military and a political crisis, wrote our most beautiful speeches, I believe. But would you share that? I mean, do you agree with that? Is Lincoln the number one of your 4 guys?
I think it's not only what he did by saving the Union and emancipating the slaves and winning the war, it's more about who he was. And when the president was talking about qualities that you've discussed all week long about what make leaders, he had those qualities you want: humility and empathy and resilience and accessibility, compassion and kindness, and really an ambition for something larger than himself. And he really stands, if we just look at him as a leader, as an example of the kind of human being we want. When I first started the book on Lincoln, I went to the home of David Donald. And as you know, he was one of the great Lincoln scholars. He was at Harvard. He was considered probably the greatest Lincoln scholar at the time. And he was so helpful to me as a rookie. But the most important thing he said to me, he lives in Lincoln, Massachusetts, on Lincoln Road in Lincoln, Massachusetts. It was great. We were living in Concord, so I was very close to go. But he showed me his library, and he said to me, he said, you will never regret living with Lincoln. You will feel like a better person because of living with him. And I really did feel that way. You had the feeling that Lincoln understood that we all had emotions like envy and anger and jealousy, but those emotions are poisonous. They'll kill you if you let them come to the fore. And he was able to let those things go from the past. So I told that same thing to Steven Spielberg when he started the movie, You'll Never Regret That. I told it to Daniel Day-Lewis, and he felt at the end that he was a better person for having lived making the movie about Lincoln. So what did he have? Well, he had humility, as I said at the start. When he first came into office that night he won the election, he knew that he didn't know enough. He didn't have enough knowledge and experience. He had only been in Congress for 1 year, 1 term, and in the state legislature for several terms. So he could not sleep that first night, and he made that decision that would define his presidency to put his 3 chief rivals, all of whom were better known, better educated, more celebrated, each one of whom thought he should be president instead of Lincoln, into the top positions in his cabinet, something that was so rarely done. And in fact, one of the things that you think about, we give him such credit for that, and Lyndon Johnson posed it in a quite different language, not quite as nobly. He said, when friends came up to Lincoln and said, "Why are you doing this? You're going to look like a figurehead." He said, "The country's in peril. These are the strongest and most able men in the country. I need them by my side." But Lyndon Johnson liked to say, it's better to have your enemies inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. So as we sit in this tent, we can think of Lyndon Johnson's great noble language. I didn't really mean to think of that's a terrible image on our minds. At any rate, so I think humility was important, and putting those people together in his cabinet meant that he had the different understandings of the different factions in the North, those that wanted emancipation immediately, those that wanted it moderately, those that wanted it never at all, just restore the Union, all of which got him up to knowing the right timing for the Emancipation Proclamation, because he was surrounded by people, and many of them didn't agree with him at the time when he finally put out the proclamation, but because he had treated them with such dignity, sharing credit when credit was often theirs, and often his rather than theirs, shouldering blame, treating them with respect, as I say, they didn't make their disagreements public. So right at the start of his presidency, he showed that. Then the quality he showed right at the end of the presidency was that willingness to not need retaliation or retribution. At the time when the North was on the eve of winning the war, there was a lot of talk among people in his camp that we have to put the Confederate people on trial, prosecute them, maybe kill them, hang them. And he said, I don't want to look backward, we have to look forward. And then, of course, that's second inaugural, when he talks about the fact that both sides were responsible, both sides prayed to the same God, neither's prayers were fully answered. With malice toward none and charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wound. How we need that healing presence today. Come back, Abraham.
I want to ask you about living with Lincoln, David Donald's phrase, and he was one of my teachers too, and I remember seeing that incredible library. I forgot it was on Lincoln Road in Lincoln, Massachusetts, but it can be a little odd living with someone you're writing a biography about. And I had the great pleasure of sitting right here a couple nights ago behind this couple here, and she turned to me and said to her husband, "This is the man I've been spending every night with for the past few weeks." And we laughed, but you are sort of living in a weird way, including at night in your dreams sometimes with these people. And I had that experience with Lincoln and wondering what would Lincoln do in a certain situation. Has that always been true for you too?
Oh, there's no question. I remember once when my boys were young and I was working on Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and they later told me they heard me in my study saying to Eleanor, just forget that he had that affair so long ago. He loves you, and you've got to know that. You're an incredible partner. And then I say to Franklin, just be kinder to her. She's sensitive. And they say, what is going on in there? But I was talking to them, and you do end up talking to them. You do end up thinking about them. I think for me, the funnest part of working with Lincoln was his sense of humor. I knew he was going to be a great statesman. I knew he was going to be a brilliant politician. And I'd read that he was a funny storyteller, but it meant that I was laughing much more than I thought I would be. Did you find that too?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, he would tell stories in the middle of the worst cabinet meetings just to get people's morale back. And some of them had to do like with Aesop's fables, and some of them were serious stories that had an important moral to them at the end. But some were just kind of stupid, silly stories that they would laugh. The one he loved to tell over and over again, and we got Daniel Day-Lewis to tell it in the movie, he would tell the story of I'm sure you know this, of Ethan Allen, the Revolutionary War hero who went to England after the war to a dinner party, and they decided to embarrass him by putting a huge picture of General George Washington in the only outhouse where he'd have to encounter it sooner or later. They figured he'd pissed off at the idea that George Washington was in such an undignified place. But he came out of the outhouse not upset at all. And they said, well, didn't you see George Washington there? Oh, yes, he said, I think it was the most appropriate place for him. What do you mean, they said? Well, he said, there's nothing to make an Englishman shit faster than the sight of General George Washington. and he had hundreds of these stories. So you can imagine. So I found myself laughing with him and self-deprecatory laughing. There's a moment when he's in a debate with Stephen Douglas. Somebody says to him, Lincoln, you're two-faced. And his immediate response is, if I had two faces, do you think I'd be wearing this face? How could you not love this kind of person?
So we've heard a lot about William McKinley this year. He's a favorite of President Trump's, and you have written about McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt beautifully. How did they handle the respective crises in their presidencies?
I mean, what's happening in the 1890s and the 1900s when McKinley and Roosevelt are there is that the Industrial Revolution has shaken up the economy, much like the tech revolution and globalization have today. I think this is the most echoing time to today. So it's the first time you have a big gap between the rich and the poor, these extraordinary millionaires side by side with tenements in New York, with all the immigrants coming in for the factory jobs. You have a sense of lots of immigrants coming in and a nativist reaction to that. You've got new inventions that are shaking up the pace of life, the automobile and the submarine and the telephone, and people are feeling a nostalgia for an earlier way of life. And there's a sense of disruption, really. And what Teddy warns about at that time is that if people in different classes and sections and religions begin viewing each other as the other rather than as common American citizens, that's when democracy will be in peril. And indeed it was. But the McKinley presidency basically said that business should run the economy. They were the seasoned veterans. They knew what they were doing. There should be no government supervision of it. Teddy came in saying the president is the one that is accountable, and the people are the ones that have to decide that balance between business and working class people and laborers. And he comes up with a great square deal for the rich and the poor, the capitalist and the laborer. But what allowed him to see what McKinley did not see? And I think in part it was the adversity he went through. And I think all the leaders that I've studied, somehow they come out of an adversity stronger than Ernest Hemingway once said, everyone is broken by life, but afterwards some are strong in the broken places. That was true of Teddy. When he first started out, he came from a very privileged background himself. He didn't vote in the state legislature for minimum wages. He didn't vote for increasing the salaries of policemen. He thought that was none of government's business to get involved in those things. But because he was there and because he was curious and because he was listening, there was a bill to ban cigars being made in tenements under terrible conditions. And at first he thought it's none of our business to do that. But somebody said to him, the labor union guy, will you go and look at what the conditions are of those people? It's living 17 people in a room with the cigar leaves all over. And it struck his empathy, and it changed him. And he not only voted for the bill, became a champion. He said, that's the great thing about politics. It teaches you fellow feeling for other people. And then what happened is, but he still was kind of central, loving the central attention. They said he wanted to be the baby at the baptism, the bride at the wedding, and the corpse at the funeral. But then what happened? He's doing well. He's 25 years old. He's become a more productive legislator. And then his wife is about to give birth to their first child, and his mother's only 49, is staying with her in New York City while he's in Albany. He gets a telegram, the daughter's born, cigars are all around. A couple hours later comes another telegram saying, you must come home at once. There's a crisis in this house. His wife was dying from the complications of childhood, and his mother had contracted typhoid fever and was dying as well. He got home in time to be with his mother when she died. 12 hours later, his wife died. And he just put a big X in his diary. He thought his life was over. He said, for joy or sorrow, it's been worked out. I will never love again. But what he did was to leave the East Coast, and he went to the Badlands. And the beauty of that landscape, for 2 years, he was a cowboy out there in the West. And that's where the conservation legacy drew from. But more importantly, the haunting beauty became a spiritual thing for him, much like I'm sure this part of the country is for many of you living up here. There's something about that beauty. And it allowed him to heal. And more importantly, it changed his attitude toward the way he was going to lead his life. Before that, he had thought, I want to be a state senator after a state representative. Then I'd like to be a congressman. Then I'd like to be a senator. Then I'll be a governor, and maybe I'll be president. Now he realized that fate could come in at any time and take everything away. So I'm just going to choose jobs that have meaning. And maybe it'll be my last job, because who knows what's going to happen, instead of trying to climb a ladder and being cautious at each point along the way. So he comes back and he becomes civil service commissioner. It was something that we've dealt with in this last time. The spoils system was in opposition before that. You could just put any of your friends in, fire the other people. They often were not qualified for the job. So there's an echo of things that we might be hearing about today. And then he became police commissioner of New York, and he sees tenements and he sees slums in a way he never would have. Then he becomes Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a very powerful position then, but he leaves it to become a soldier, and that's the Rough Riders, where he brings people from Harvard and Yale together with the woodsmen and the cowboys and the ranchers. And by the time he's president, he's seen all the ways of life, and then he takes a train around the country when he's president. He goes to every single state with the same message: the rich and the poor, the capitalists and the laborers. I want a square deal, fairness for them all. And again, that's the kind of experience and sadness that led him to that much broader perspective than he would have had before.
You mentioned a few minutes ago the great difficulty of Franklin Roosevelt's transition into the presidency, which not only occurred at a time of banks closing and the economy in free fall, but it was also a very long transition back then, from November to March 4th. And what were the leadership qualities that allowed him not only to get through the transition and into the early weeks, but to build one of the great presidencies of all time?
Yeah, you know, obviously that's what your book is about. That transition was so long, and that only later did they make it a change
Right.
to January 20th, when they realized how long FDR had to wait and wait and wait to be president, or Lincoln at the same way.
Right.
That's why Lincoln was on the verge.
Right.
But and anyway, I think what happened for FDR was, again, resilience from the polio made a big difference in the kind of leader that he became, the path-breaking leader. He would have always been a social person. He was charming. He was a good fellow, well-met, and had leadership qualities. But somehow, having contracted polio when he's still in his 30s and having to face the possibility that he would never be able to walk on his own power again, and he spent almost 7 years before going back into public life and becoming a run for the governor, just trying to walk, using every experiment he could. He would walk up the stairs, you know, holding on to either side, and each time he made one more stair, he would celebrate. He would walk on his carpet to the library in the mornings, crawling in order to strengthen his upper body so he could manipulate a wheelchair, and trying all that stuff and never losing hope that somehow he might be able to become a public person again. He brings himself with that paralyzed experience. Francis Perkins said he emerged much more warm-hearted than ever before, able to identify with other people to whom fate had dealt an unkind hand. So at Warm Springs, he was dealing with fellow polios, and he taught them that joy could still be in life. They would have wheelchair dances. They would have pool exercises in the morning. They'd have theatricals at night. And the people wrote about the fact that he gave them a sense of purpose and joy back in his life. So here he comes into the presidency, and he can't wait to take the helm of power. I mean, it's interesting, during those months, he was just so anxious, I need to get in there, I want the responsibility, which is another mark, I think, of a path-breaking leader, to want to take that risk. And what does he do in that first inaugural? But he gives that people hope again. I mean, he starts off telling them that this is not your fault. A lot of people felt it was their fault they didn't have a job. There are stories of men going out in their suits in the morning, just walking around the village, coming home at night as if they had gone to work because they were so embarrassed. He said, it's not your fault. It's the failure of leadership, and I'm here to provide that leadership. And then he talked about what he would do to get Congress to put people to jobs who couldn't get jobs, what he was going to do to repair the system, and then the famous phrase, the only thing to fear is fear itself. But he was the one who made them feel that things were going to be all right. And by the end of his talk, that night, there are headlines all over the country, the government still lives. Because he said the government has a responsibility for this. This is why we're in this together. We have a leader. We finally have a leader. And then hundreds of thousands of letters went into the White House, you know, just talking to him then. They felt they could talk to him. He was their friend. One letter came from a man, was my favorite. He had lost his job, he said. His wife was mad at him. His roof had fallen off. His dog had run away. But now everything was all right because he was there as president, Franklin Roosevelt. And that's the mystery of leadership somehow, the mood of the country. He had to do that first before he could get Congress to do the banking crisis, before he could get Congress to pass the legislation that allowed people to get public jobs and deal with the stock market. He needed the morale of the people. And I think that experience of the polio was what changed the possibility of his being the right leader at the right time.
One of the specific qualities of leadership you've identified so well in these 4 cases is that a great leader is not afraid to hire independent people for advice. Sometimes people who don't like each other, sometimes people who have run against the candidate himself, as was the case with Lincoln and Team of Rivals. But FDR also had a team of, if not rivals for the nomination, strong and independent members of his cabinet and other kinds of advisors. So who were his sounding boards?
I think the most important person that he had was Eleanor Roosevelt. He liked to say about her, it's not the most romantic thing to say, but it was meant as a great compliment. She's a welcome thorn in my side. She's always willing to argue with me, always willing to question my assumptions. He had strong-minded people who could do. That's why you need them there. It's not even so much whether they're a rival or not. It's that they feel free to disagree with you and to tell you why. And Eleanor was always able to do that. I mean, she had an extraordinary capacity. When he was first in the New Deal programs, she would travel the country 200 days a year and visit the various New Deal programs and bring him back honest reports of which ones were working and which ones were failing. Often in bureaucracy, you don't get that. And sometimes it pissed him off when she would come home with these reports, so many reports and so many memos to him. He promised her if only she gave 3 memos every night, he'd answer them by the morning. And then she sent so many memos to General Marshall during World War II about discrimination in the Army that he had to assign a separate general whose only task was to deal with Eleanor Roosevelt memos. And then at the same time, she had weekly press conferences, and she made a rule that only female reporters could come to her press conferences. So all over the country, stuffy publishers are hiring their first female reporter. An entire generation got their start because of Eleanor Roosevelt's press conferences. And then she argued, even as the war was heating up, or even as we were preparing for the war before Pearl Harbor, that women should go to work at the factories. And at first, the factory owners decided, we haven't got time for a social revolution in the middle of preparing and mobilizing for the war. They'll never learn to operate these complicated machines. They'll distract the men on the assembly lines. But of course, by the time we were in the war in 42 and 43, with so many men in the armed forces, they had to open their doors to women. And the great thing was that when women formed 60% of the jobs in the shipyards and the factories, productivity went up rather than down as they had predicted. So I love one of the factory owners decided, better do a study and figure out how these women learned these complicated machines so well and so quickly. I love the answer that came back on one of the firms. They said, it was very simple. When a woman, unlike a man, was asked to operate a new piece of machinery, she would ask directions. Any of us who used to travel with you guys, never would the window be open. Now the GPS is, of course, there, making a lot of arguments not happen. But I think the important thing was she was there to give truth to power, and it wasn't always so easy. It made their relationship strained at times. But he later said that he couldn't, always there was something she'd tell him, and he'd say, no, I'm not ready for that. She was the agitator. He was the politician. So she's pushing him from the outside in, just like Frederick Douglass did with Lincoln. You need those people who come from the ground up, a civil rights movement or gay rights movement. They push you to do the right thing, and you have to be the politician who figures out when is the right timing.
So Roosevelt gets us through the Depression very ably. The government doesn't fall, as you say, but then he has a huge second crisis. He has to deal with the rise of Hitler in Germany and other fascists in other countries and bring a country that was quite unwilling to go to war into war to defend our allies and essentially to defend democracy. He was dealing with a different version of the phrase America first. And how did he pull that one off? That was a very difficult feat of leadership.
Yeah, it's amazing that you can have 2 major crises and be able to somehow deal with both of them in very different ways. What happened is he saw what was happening in Europe, and in 1937 he gave his famous speech called "We Must Quarantine the Dictators," but it was so far ahead of public opinion that he was blasted for it. There were even threats that he'd be impeached for getting us involved in what wasn't our business. So he realized, I have to move step by step and just bring people along the way. And so he finally realized, even by 1940, once Hitler did everything they did in Western Europe in May of 1940, he realized he had to change his relationship with the business community, which had been marked by hostility at the end of the New Deal. So what does he do? He calls in 2 top Republicans to become his Chrysler, the head of Chrysler, the head of Sears, to become the head of his production agencies. He brings 2 top Republicans into his cabinet, Stimson and Knox, in the very top positions. And he decides that I have to make an alliance with business. Only they can build the tanks, the weapons, and the ships and the planes that we need. And what was extraordinary, what they eventually did was to give money for the factories to change over from cars to be able to make ships and planes and tanks. They gave pinball factories, suddenly became grenade factories. The transformation was extraordinary. And as they did it, we were able, even before Pearl Harbor, to have an assembly line going so that he was able surreptitiously to send what seemed to be surplus weapons to England, because we had all these neutrality laws, like you're suggesting, against it. And then by 1942 and 43, so great was that productivity that America was producing a plane every 4 minutes, a tank every 7 minutes, and a ship was launched every single day that a year before took 250 days to launch. And that's what we have to remember. And the American people responded. They went into those factories 24 hours a day. The soldiers went out into the field. The home front mobilized. And we were able to win that war against somebody that had to be beaten in Adolf Hitler. So remembering that and remembering how far we were and how far we came, again, is why history is so important. You're going to not teach about the war because the war is a bad thing or because we were in bad shape at the beginning of it. Just the contrary. It shows what we can do when America's together.
So if we can turn to the 1960s, a decade of relevance to many of us, and especially on a campus founded in the near aftermath of the 60s, Lyndon Johnson had a crisis to deal with from the moment he became president in the wake of the brutal assassination of John F. Kennedy. And no president wants to come into office under those conditions, and yet he showed extraordinary skill and courage and a kind of grace and eloquence in the early weeks of his presidency. And so what were the qualities that allowed him to prevail at that hard time?
Yeah, I mean, here's where he really took a huge risk, because he decided, even in those first days, that the most important thing he could do to somehow establish that he had the reins of power in his hands. He knew that people didn't trust him. They didn't know a lot about him. He knew that they loved John Kennedy, that especially the civil rights community would be worried about a Southerner now becoming president. And that was the major domestic issue at the time. Finally, after Birmingham, Alabama had happened, John Kennedy had produced a civil rights bill to end segregation in the South in June of 1963. But it was stuck. It hadn't gotten through the House. They didn't think it could possibly get through the Senate with a filibuster. So there was a real worry that the violence that had been prevented, I mean, the civil rights movement was so nonviolent, they kept their cool when so many things were happening to them, that something might happen if something wasn't able to get through on civil rights. So he made the decision that he was going to make the passage of the Civil Rights Bill his #1 priority. His friend said to him, "You can't do this. There's no way it's going to get through the Senate, even if it were to get through the House. You'll have to go before the presidency if you want to run yourself in 11 months, and you'll be a failed president. Nothing else will get through." And so they said, you only have a certain amount of currency to expend as president. You can't spend it on this. And then he famously said, then what the hell is the presidency for? And he made that decision to go for civil rights. And then what does he do? He knows the Congress. I mean, he was the man of the Senate, man of the Congress. So he has every single congressman in groups of 30 over to dinner at the White House. Many of them had never been to a social function in the White House. They could bring their spouses, and then Lady Bird would take them on a tour of the mansion, and he would sit and talk to the guys until 2 in the morning, and he would be getting promises from them about what they might do. And then the next day, he would call them up, and he would start calling them at 6. He'd start calling them at midnight. He called a senator even at 2 a.m. He said, "I hope I didn't wake you up." And then the senator said, "No, I was just lying here looking at the ceiling, hoping my president would call." And then he had this little tape machine in his Oval Office, so whenever he talked to them and he made promises, if you go with me on this bill, if you can help to break that filibuster, I'll give you a dam, a public works project, whatever it is you want. And then he had written it down in the transcript so he could hold them to their promises. But the most important thing he knew he had to do with the Democratic Party split in two was to get the Republicans to go on the side of civil rights. And that meant getting Everett Dirksen, the minority leader from Illinois. And he was one who was great for bargaining, too. When you hear those tapes with him and Dirksen, You want me to come to Peoria, to Springfield, to Quincy, I'll come anywhere you want me to come. You want a dam, you want a public works project, you want a pardon, what do you want? Whatever you want. But then finally he closes with, Everett, if you can come with me on this bill and bring some Republicans, 200 years from now, school children will know only two names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. How could Dirksen resist? Anyway, he brought 22 Republicans to join the 44 Northern Democrats to break that filibuster and bring that critical bill to the floor. And then once that happened, it really opened the ground for everything else that was going to come later, for the election that he would win. He also got a tax cut through. Interestingly, the liberals were on the side of a tax cut then, and it helped to generate the economy. And there was a great risk in that, because if he had failed, which everybody thought he would, that would have been probably the end of his presidency.
Earlier speakers have addressed risk as one of the main elements of leadership, so that's a pretty good example of a risk that paid off for him. You've talked to me and you've written this wonderful book about your relationship with your late husband, Dick Goodwin. It's for sale here, and I love that you had a quality in your conversation with Dick that I think sounds like Franklin and Eleanor, and that a kind of creative disagreement now and then. You didn't always agree in ranking the presidents the same way, but he worked for Kennedy as well as Johnson. You worked for Johnson alone, but can you talk about what the transition was like for him from Kennedy to LBJ and the role he played in the early Great Society?
Yeah, so what happened is my husband had been almost everywhere you'd want somebody to be in the 60s. I mean, he graduated from Harvard in 58, and then he went to clerk for Justice Frankfurter, and then he did the investigation of the television quiz shows. Some of you remember $64,000 question in 21. He's the one who discovered that they were being given the questions ahead of time, that the whole thing was corrupt. A movie was made about it by Robert Redford called Quiz Show, where my husband was played by Rob Morrow. But then after that, he was given a chance to be the second speechwriter under Ted Sorensen, and Ted knows about speechwriting, having worked for Bill Clinton on speechwriting and working with Hillary Clinton as well. And then he stayed on in the White House staff and did a lot of civil rights stuff, did a lot of things he cared about. And then John Kennedy was killed, and he ended up going to work for Lyndon Johnson. And even though we had these 300 boxes that he'd saved for our whole time, which not only went to Lyndon Johnson, but then he turned against the war, and he was with Bobby Kennedy, his great friend, best friend as it turned out, was with him when he died. So he's everywhere in the 60s, but he wouldn't open these boxes for all of our married life because the 60s had ended so sadly with the deaths of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, with the riots in the streets and the campus violence, that he just wanted to look ahead, not backward. Until finally, when he turned 80, he came down the stairs one day singing, "Oh, what a beautiful morning." I said, "What's going on?" He said, "I finally decided." Then he goes into Elvis, "It's now or never." And I knew what he meant, open the boxes. So we made a pact that every weekend we would go through the boxes. And we would start from the beginning, really Barbara Tuchman-like, not knowing that John Kennedy would die, not knowing that Lyndon Johnson would bring the war about in order to enjoy the Great Society, not knowing that Bobby would die. And when he went through the boxes, the extraordinary thing that happened was when he remembered the extraordinary nature of 64 and 65 before the war in Vietnam, the height of his powers, the height of Lyndon Johnson's powers rather, that he began to feel good about Johnson again. He came to bed one night, he said, "Oh my God, I'm feeling affection for the old guy again," because he had begun to turn against him because of the war. But anyway, we discovered, not through the boxes, but through listening to one of the tapes that Johnson had, how he actually got to Lyndon Johnson. And we didn't quite know that. It was so much fun to be able to figure this out. And what it is, it's a conversation between Bill Moyers and Lyndon Johnson in the March of 1964, and Johnson saying, "I need somebody who can work on my speeches, who can put rhythm into my speeches, who can put sex into my speeches, who can write great Churchillian phrases in my speeches. Who can that be?" And Moyers had worked with Dick at the Peace Corps, so he knew that Dick was a great speechwriter. He said, "Well, I think Dick Goodwin's the only one, but he's not one of us," meaning that there were the Kennedys and the Johnsons, and he was on the other side. But Dick said, "Just have him come and let's see what he can do on a poverty message." And he came and he did it, and then he ended up staying on. So about a month or so after he's there, Moyers calls him up one morning and says, "The president wants us to talk to him about a Johnson program now. After the tax cuts gotten through and now the civil rights bill looks like it's on its way through, he wants his own program." So Dick said, "Are we going to the Oval Office?" And he said, "No, we're going to the pool, the White House pool." So they get to the pool. Johnson is swimming in the pool naked, up and down, side stroking. Dick said he looked like a whale going up and down the pool. And the two of them are standing there in their suits and ties. And Johnson said, well, come on in. What are you doing, guys? So they have no choice but to strip as well. So now you have three naked guys swimming around in the pool. Finally, Johnson pulls over to the side, and he starts talking about what he wants for his own program. And it's going to be Medicare. It's going to be aid to education. It's going to be civil rights and voting rights and immigration reform. The whole thing, he had it already in his head. And then he said, well, we have to give a speech somewhere to lay out this program. And we have to have a name for whatever this program is going to be. So they decided it'll be at the University of Michigan. You know, as a speechwriter, sometimes you have a speech, it's a deadline for getting the program together. And that was kind of chutzpah, because that's where John Kennedy had sort of announced the Peace Corps. So that was famous, and now he's going to go announce whatever this program is. So they need a name for it. So Dick tried out, and other people were saying it should be the Glorious Society, the Splendid Society, the Good Society. And he tried out the Great Society in a couple small speeches, and it caught on. So that's how the Great Society was born, in a pool with three naked guys swimming around.
I'm remembering Galbraith's book, The Affluent Society. I wonder if that was in the mix.
I think it probably was.
Yeah.
It was the idea that in an affluent society, people have a responsibility to share somehow so that most people can have a chance. What Lincoln said is, in a democracy, people should have, I think I've got this right, a chance to rise to the level of their talent and discipline. You can't give a person more talent. If they're not going to work hard, you can't do that. But everybody who wants to should have that chance. And that's what Johnson was talking about. That's what the education program was. That's what civil rights was in many ways. That's what Medicare was. All of these things were people having a chance for health, opportunity to rise to their level of, and that's what democracy is.
Before our conversation, please go ahead. Doris and I were talking about our shared reverence for the work of Robert Caro, this incredible multi-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson. It's still ongoing, and it's impossible not to feel affection for LBJ, reading some of the early chapters about his poverty. And Caro is such a great social historian that he lived in West Texas for a long time and found out that the women of the families had to carry pails of water very long distances from the wells, and there weren't very many. And he just did a lot to alleviate poverty for millions of Americans. So that is an achievement. Doris, you've written about so many different kinds of leaders. Are there undervalued leadership qualities that you can help us to understand?
Yeah, I do think the most undervalued leadership quality is the ability of a leader to find time to think, to relax and replenish energies. Energy is not, it's not infinite. And when they're not able to do that, then they can't go on, especially during difficult times. So Lincoln actually went to the theater 100 times during the Civil War. He said when the lights went down and a Shakespeare play came on, for a few precious moments, he could imagine himself back at the War of the Roses rather than the Civil War that was raging. And then, of course, as I was saying, I think his sense of humor was also his way of relaxing. He said that a good story was better for him than a drop of whiskey, and that somehow humor whistled off sadness. Teddy Roosevelt would go on these ridiculous exercise mounts, two hours every day at the end of the day to relax. Sometimes it would be a boxing match, sometimes a wrestling match. Mostly it was a walk in the wooded areas of Rock Creek Park, where he had to make a rule. You couldn't go around any obstacle. You had to go through it. So if you came to a rock, you'd have to climb it. Precipice, you'd have to go down it. So people hated going on these walks with him. And there's a great story of the French ambassador coming, and he's dressed all in his silk outfit. He's thinking, oh my God, we're going to be walking on the Champs-Élysées. And he finds himself in the woods following him, and he can't wait till it's over. They finally come to the river, and he thinks, thank God it's over. But then Teddy says, well, this is an obstacle. We can't go around it. No sense in getting our clothes wet. So he takes off his clothes. So the French ambassador said, so I, for the honor of France, took off my clothes as well. But I left on my lavender kid gloves. And why? Because it might be embarrassing if we should meet ladies on the other side. But the best person who's able to relax is FDR. During World, I get wars mixed up. During World War II, he had a cocktail party every night in the White House, and the rule was you couldn't talk about the war. You could talk about books you'd read, movies you'd seen, gossip. He loved that, as long as the war wasn't mentioned. And after a while, this cocktail party was so important to him, he wanted the people who would be ready for the cocktail party to live on the second floor of the White House, so they'd be right there for the cocktail party. So it became the most exclusive hotel you could imagine. His foreign policy advisor, Harry Hopkins, came for dinner one night early in the war, slept over, never left until the war was coming to an end. His secretary, Missy Lehand, lived right there with the family in the White House. Eleanor Roosevelt's great friend, Lorena Hickok, had a bedroom next to her. Princess Martha came on the weekends from Norway. And the great Winston Churchill came and spent weeks at a time in a bedroom right there on the second floor of the White House.
Wasn't he naked a lot of the time, too?
You will see him naked in minutes.
Yeah.
So what happens is when I was finishing the book about Franklin and Eleanor and was talking about it, I wished I could go back up there and see that second floor. I'd been up there with LBJ when I was working with him, but I wasn't thinking then, where was Franklin, where was Eleanor, where was Harry Hopkins? So I mentioned it on a radio program, and Hillary Clinton was then in the White House listening. So she called me up the radio station, invited me to a sleepover in the White House. She said we could then wander the corridor together and figure out where everyone had slept 50 years earlier. So 2 weeks later, she invited my husband and me to the president was giving a state dinner, after which we wandered the corridor between 12 and 2 a.m. with my map in hand, figured out, yes, Chelsea Clinton is sleeping where Harry Hopkins was, the Clintons are sleeping where FDR was, we were in Winston Churchill's bedroom. There was no way I could sleep. And so that I was imagining he was in the corner drinking his brandy and smoking a cigar. But that story that's told about that first visit to the White House when he was there, right after Pearl Harbor, he and Roosevelt were set to sign a document that put the Associated Nations against the Axis powers, but no one liked the word Associated Nations. So Roosevelt awakened that morning with the whole new idea of calling them the United Nations against the Axis powers. He was so excited he had some wheeled into Churchill's bedroom, our same bedroom, to tell him the news. But, and this is where he's going to be naked, he comes out of the bathtub with absolutely nothing on. He's just come out. So Roosevelt said, "I'm so sorry, I'll come back in a few moments." Churchill, ever able to speak, stands up very straight, dripping from the tub, and says, "Oh no, please stay. The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." How can you do that? So then Roosevelt tells him the idea of the United Nations. He has the further presence of mind, quoting an entire poem in British literature where the words United Nations had once been used. So the next morning I couldn't wait to go in the bathtub, and then I truly felt I am in the greatness of the past.
I'm getting a signal that Sean would like to take questions from the audience. Maybe I can ask one more, and then we'll go to Q&A. But you have, a couple days ago, David Remnick spoke by Zoom to us, and many of these talks have ended with notes of inspiration. How can we make a difference? How can we push back again in a time of growing insecurity about our civil rights? David said, "Hope is the thing with feathers," quoting Emily Dickinson. It was a panel about Alexei Navalny and his great courage. And where do you look for hope in your study of these great leaders, and what are the specific things we can do to feel better?
I think that the way it comes down to history is that most of the important change that's taken place for social justice in this country has come from the ground up. When Lincoln was called a liberator, he said, "Don't call me that. It was the anti-slavery movement and the Union soldiers that did it all." The progressive movement was already there in the cities and states before Teddy Roosevelt took over. It was in the social gospel for religion. It was in the settlement houses in the cities. And obviously the civil rights movement was critical for what Lyndon Johnson was able to do. So we have to just take hope from the fact that it's the citizens, the gay rights movement, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement that have been from the ground up. It's us, it's the citizens. I think if there were one thing I wish we could do right now, especially for that younger generation, would be to have a national service program. They come out of high school and they go to another part of a country. I mean, just think of what it might mean. They go to a different part of the country and they're living with these people that they thought were the other, whether it's going from the city to the country, or the country to the city, or the west to the east coast. And so many of our presidents have wanted that, just so they know what it's like. You put them to work on missions where people feel they're making a difference. You make a difference in your local city, your local state, and then maybe you'll be able to make a difference in Washington. It's got to come from the ground up, but it's happened every other, so it's up to us as the citizens right now. And I still trust the fundamental decency of the American people that they're going to come through this, that they have to.
Thank you, Doris. So we're ready to take questions in the same spirit, questions from all of you. And I think there are two people with microphones, and they will find you.
Excuse me. That was great, thank you. I absorbed the Caro books about Johnson, And as you know, he's emphasizes the, I don't know what the right word is, the dual nature, or the dichotomy in Johnson's personality of, he was a bastard and a racist and whatever on one side, and a champion of the poor and civil rights and so forth on the other. And I don't think Caro ever comes down one side or the other. Did you feel the same dichotomy about him, the sort of Jekyll and Hyde, that's a cliche, I'm sorry, sense when you knew him, or did you have a more even one side or the other?
No, I think one of the things Bill Moyers said about Lyndon Johnson was that 13 of the most complex people he ever knew. You never knew what side was going to come out. And even, I think the understanding of where he came from, whether that was racist or, or against civil rights, he evolved over time as he got power, and he wanted to use that power in the right way. And nothing will take away what he did on civil rights and voting rights. My husband's greatest moment was having helped him on that "We Shall Overcome" speech after the Selma demonstrations, and where he says, at a certain moment, he said, "This is not a Negro problem, not a white problem, not a Northern problem, not a Southern problem. It's an American problem, and we're met here tonight, not as Republicans, not as Democrats, to meet that problem." Every now and then history and fate meet at a certain time in a certain place. So it was in Lexington and Concord, so it was at Appomattox, so it was in Selma, Alabama. It was an extraordinary night. As I listened to that speech when I was in graduate school, I felt a sense of exuberance that we were going to be doing something so important at that time. And little could I have imagined, as I listened to it, that a few years later I'd be working for the man who delivered it so incredibly, Lyndon Johnson, or more importantly, that I would meet and marry the man who helped him write that speech, Richard Goodwin. So I think he had all those different sides in him. He could be mean, he could be petty, he could be cruel at times, but he could also be benevolent and kind and compassionate. And it was just part of his personality. But I think as a leader, and that dichotomy is worked out with the Vietnam War, always be a scar in his legacy. But the domestic issues are coming up in people's minds. He's rising in the historians' polls now. There was one recent poll which he would have loved to see where he was one ahead of John Kennedy. That would have made him very happy.
Okay, other questions?
In the back here.
Thank you so much for your writing on Lincoln and the Roosevelts. I'm a native Kentuckian, and Lincoln, that's what you learn in school. It's all about Lincoln. But I wanted to ask you what you thought of something that I heard recently. It was Angus King, Senator King, was at a protest, and he came up and he said, right now, he said, our Congress is not doing their job. And the courts are holding the line to some extent. He said, it's up to you. It's up to you people, every single one of you, to do this. And I think that we have a tendency as Americans to want somebody else to come in and fix it for us. And how do you feel a leader can work with us?
That's an absolutely critical point that you've made, and I really agree with what Angus King said. I think he's an extraordinary man, an extraordinary leader, just from what I know from. You have some great people here. I luckily know Janet Mills. I think she's an incredible governor as well. But I think he's right. When you look at, but it takes organization, it takes patience. What if the civil rights leaders had decided after Birmingham, Alabama, when the dogs are set upon them, when the hoses are put on them, that's it, I'm not going to do it anymore, I'm going to retaliate. The discipline it took for that non-discipline, non-violent movement to continue on is what we need. People have said, why is it that we had a million-person march after Trump was elected and nothing really came from that? All those women came together. Or why is it that the Black Lives Matter movement didn't produce change? Partly because there wasn't that sense of training, there wasn't that sense of non-violence. Sometimes people subjected them to things that made it look more violent. But it's a very serious job that citizens have right now. And we should feel emboldened by it, because it is up to us. The government's not something out there, it's us. And this is still our government, and the citizens have to. I've been very emboldened and by listening to those town halls that we've been having all around the country, people speaking up. but it has to continue. It just ebbs and flows, and then it goes away, and then we get distracted by something else. I mean, to be talking about Epstein for an entire week, I mean, we have to be talking about what's happening to the big, beautiful bill, what's going to happen to people in government, what's going to happen to the economy, what's going to happen to all of us. And we have to be out there protesting and figure out ways in our local congressmen, our local state legislatures. If Texas is going to go and redistrict things, then maybe we have a lot of other states that can be redistricted in the same way. It's a terrible way to think about it. It's like an arms race, but we can't allow these things to happen without fighting them. And the voting rights is the most important thing. I mean, one of the things that LBJ said is the fundamental right upon which all the others depend. And we have to make sure that the next voting elections are fair and free and that more people can vote. Instead of making people not able to vote, we should be making everybody possibly able to vote. And right now it's being diminished, that right to vote that was so precious in 1965. But we can change things. After a while, the people will be heard. And I think they're beginning to, but they just have to keep going week after week. I think they should be out there every day if they can be. I shouldn't be saying they, I should be too.
Over here.
Hi. History and civics education has been greatly diminished in public schools in recent years. As a local high school teacher, I wondered if you'd be willing to briefly share your thoughts. Why teach history, and even what would you prioritize?
I mean, I think one of the things that's the scariest of what's been happening is that education is under siege itself. I mean, books are being banned. Teachers are frightened in some of the states where the state legislatures have made it a law that if you start talking about things in a certain way, your job might be at issue. You know, that maybe you shouldn't even teach about Jim Crow because it'll make people feel bad that we did that, or teach about slavery. Once we start making a celebratory view of America and not a view that we've come through these times before, as I've said, and we've become stronger as a result. It's a great country. It's still the best country in the world. That's why people want to be here rather than anywhere else. But we have to live up to that reputation of our idea as a free society. And when we're telling people what they cannot teach, and we're diminishing the number of people that are even studying history, and that people feel like, what's the point of studying it? We've got to fight that too. And in my own profession, I'm sure you feel this way too. When you love it so much, I just find it heartbreaking that it's being told, that anybody's telling us how to teach it, rather than the way you teach it is what happened, as much as you can understand what happened.
I do. Couldn't agree
I do.
more.
I'm marrying you. I do.
For me, it's a great consolation to go into the ideas, and I'm working on an edited volume about the history of the Declaration of Independence, and to see how the founders, thought about it. This remarkable step forward gives me hope, and I hope some courage also. Question in the back?
I was wondering, based on all of your knowledge of history, how right now where we're seeing such a big divide between people in one party, specifically the Democratic Party, how we can work on bridging that divide going into the next election.
Yeah, I think, you know, what I think the party that's being divided right now, the Democrats, they just have to figure out what are the core values of what we have as a party together, and where can we compromise on things that we have to figure out what it is the country is responding to. The Democrats have to figure out how to use the bully pulpit that they have to explain why government matters. Still, the fundamental difference in some ways is what should the responsibility of government be. That's what was at the turn of the 20th century with Teddy Roosevelt, because the people that were in power thought that business should decide what the economy was doing and that government had no responsibility. As I said, Teddy said, no, the people decide what the economy should be. And now that's still the same issue, but it depends on educating the country and finding what those common values are in a party when the party is splitting. I'm not sure it's as deeply split as we're thinking it is. I think once some leaders come about and we've got people that can, the Democrats have people that can be out there talking, that maybe that will make a difference. But, you know, in the end, if I could just say something about what's underneath all of this, I think, is that we need people who are running for office now that have character. Character is everything. I worry that the problem is that it's taking so much to become a public figure now. You have to raise so much money. Campaign finance is absolute essential. You know that you're going to be taken apart in a primary. You know that your private life is going to be exposed. And maybe the best people are deciding they don't want to do that. And the ones that are there just want to stay forever and they don't want to leave. I mean, the thing that struck me most about Lincoln was that, you know this story really, when I ended Team of Rivals, I just didn't want to end with his death. So I was lucky to find an interview that Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian writer, had given to a New York reporter. And he talked about Lincoln had always wanted to be remembered after he died, and that was partly what drove him the whole time, that his story would be told. But even he could not have imagined how far he would be remembered, as this story will tell. Tolstoy said he had just come back from the Caucasus, where there are a group of wild barbarians. They never left this part of Russia, and they wanted Tolstoy to tell stories of the great men of history. So Tolstoy told them about Napoleon and Alexander the Great and Frederick the Great and Julius Caesar, and they loved it. Tolstoy said, but the chief stood up and he said, but wait, you haven't told us about the greatest ruler of them all. We want to hear about that man who spoke with the voice of thunder, who laughed like the sunrise, who came from that place called America that is so far from here that if a young man should travel there, he'd be an old man when he arrived. Tell us of that man. Tell us of Abraham Lincoln. Tolstoy was stunned to know that Lincoln's name had reached this remote corner, but he told them everything he could about Lincoln. And then the most important thing is the reporter said to him, all right, so what made Lincoln so great? He said, well, he wasn't as great a general as Napoleon, not as great a statesman perhaps as Frederick the Great. His greatness consisted in the moral fiber of his being, in his character. That's what we need in our kids in school. That's what we need in our children that we're bringing up. That's what we need in our public life again today. If we have character, we're going to get through this.
Amen. I think we have time for one more question. Is that right, Sean?
Yes, one more. So put your hands up in the air. All right, we got way back in the back.
Thank you very much for a wonderful learning session for all of us. We always think about bringing people together and starting from our differences. I would like to leave us with one thought. Think about a zipper. No zipper comes together unless at least one end attaches and then the rest starts and eventually encapsulates everything. Let us look for what brings us together first and start from that and continue on so that we can bring our lovely country together.
That's a beautiful metaphor. It's a beautiful metaphor. I think I'll be thinking of that every time I'm trying to get a zipper to work to go on. But you know, what I'm hoping is that maybe the 250th anniversary, that's why I think those of us who are historians, just as Ted said, are hoping if we can remember what it was that made us a special nation in the first place, what drew us together, what does that Declaration of Independence, I'd love you to talk about that too, because I think that's, if we just think about the Declaration of Independence as what made Lincoln's great Gettysburg Address possible, it really is what Lyndon Johnson used to talk about, that these are the values that we have. We were founded as an idea. We're not just a country founded on a physical place. We were founded on that idea. If we can restore what those ideas were. I mean, we used to teach civics when I was in school, and that mattered. We learned about all this. But I'd love you to think about that, too.
I do think next year is a rare and important chance to come together in that way and think about our history from the perspective of the right as well as the left, and let's not forget the center. And I've been reading a lot about the writing of the Declaration by Jefferson, a most complicated founder who had about 400 slaves, but he put in that imperishable language about the fundamental rights that were being celebrated as the country was being created. It's the birth certificate of the country, and inside the birth certificate are these claims to equality and the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson was a big enough thinker to put in something that threatened his own economic well-being. And then, as you said, Lincoln comes along and sees that pearl. He calls it the apple of gold inside the frame of silver. It's an unusual metaphor from the Bible, but that concept of equality and all people have access to it was for Lincoln the key message of the Declaration, and he reinterpreted it beautifully at Gettysburg and in other documents. And so for me, going back to that courageous openness at the beginning of our history is a nice way to go into the year 2026. And I hope both sides can show that courage that you're talking about to take a half step toward the other side, because I don't think it can keep going the way it is right now without the violence you remember from the 60s and terrible civil discord. And I pray for all of us that we can avoid that.
I think that's why, as you mentioned earlier, listen, listen, listen. Just listen to other people and find out why they feel like they do, why somebody else is feeling a different way. It's just a human quality to want to understand somebody else. And that's why we just have to bring people together from other sides. That's the problem with the silos that we're living in today, and the fact that we don't have the same facts, and we're watching different things on social media, watching different things on television. But somehow we can break through that, maybe with the 250th. And the framers would be proud of us if we were able to use 250 to get somehow back on a path where we're understanding the fundamental decency of one another, even if we have different ideas. Yay for all of you. Thank you for all being here.
Thank you, Doris. We'll see you at the reception, and books are on sale in the bookstore.
Thank you, everyone. What a wonderful session. Thank you so much, Ted and Doris. And yes, please join us in the Geyer Oval for the reception. And thank you all for your support of College of the Atlantic and for joining us this week. We couldn't be happier than to have had this week with you together. Thank you so much.